The champagne flute slipped through my fingers, crystal fragments scattering across the polished marble as my new daughter-in-law's words echoed through the Whitmore family estate. "This is the burden we're stuck with," Chelsea had announced to her wealthy parents with that rehearsed smile, her perfectly manicured hand barely grazing my shoulder. The entire wedding reception seemed to freeze, 200 guests turning to witness the 56-year-old woman in the understated navy dress standing amid the wreckage. That's when William Whitmore's face drained of all color beneath his pristine, white tuxedo shirt. Let me explain how we arrived at this moment, because this story is about to become quite remarkable. My name is Catherine Wells, though most people call me Kate. I've spent the last 14 years mastering the art of deliberate invisibility, which proved to be exceptional preparation for what would unfold. My son Alexander had been dating Chelsea for 7 months, and I'd met her exactly twice before today. Brief dinners where she'd posed pointed questions about my modest circumstances and whether I might need assistance with financial management at your age. The wedding itself was spectacular. I'll grant them that. The Whitmore estate stretched across 45 acres of immaculately groomed Massachusetts countryside, complete with a cathedral that could seat 250 guests and gardens that must have cost a fortune to maintain. Chelsea floated down the aisle in a gown that probably exceeded most people's annual salary. Alexander looked happier than I'd seen him since his father passed away. I'd selected my attire deliberately. A navy blue dress from a respectable department store paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that would attract unwanted attention. I'd discovered long ago that the secret to preserving certain privacies was to appear exactly as people expected. A widow living comfortably but modestly on her late husband's pension and insurance settlement. The ceremony was beautiful, even if I did notice Chelsea's mother, Vivian, evaluating me like I was something that didn't quite belong in their world. The reception was where circumstances became intriguing. The Whitmore family had spared no expense, featuring ice sculptures, a 16-piece orchestra, and enough floral arrangements to stock a boutique. I'd settled at a corner table, observing my 35-year-old son dance with his new bride when Chelsea approached with her parents in tow. "Mother and father," she'd said with that saccharine tone that made my teeth ache, "I want you to meet Alexander's mother." Then came the words that changed everything. William Whitmore's champagne flute had frozen midway to his lips, his eyes locked on my face with an expression of dawning recognition that made my stomach clench. "Catherine Wells," he whispered. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. "Wait, aren't you the woman from the Whitmore Enterprises acquisition meeting 3 years ago? Aren't you that mysterious investor who purchased my company?" William Whitmore's words sliced through the reception chatter like a blade through silk. The color drained from Chelsea's face as she looked between her father and me, confusion replacing her earlier smugness. Vivian Whitmore's diamond bracelet caught the chandelier light as her hand flew to her throat, and I could practically hear the calculations spinning in her socialite mind. The truth is, most people don't recognize authentic wealth when they see it. They expect diamonds and designer labels, luxury vehicles, and obvious displays. What they don't anticipate is a woman in a simple but elegant dress who shops at conventional stores and drives a dependable sedan. That's precisely what I've been counting on for the past 14 years. It began with my late husband Jonathan's invention, a small piece of technology that revolutionized smartphone battery efficiency. We were both engineers, Jonathan and I, working for a tech company in Silicon Valley during the early 2000s. When Jonathan developed his power management system in 2008, we thought perhaps we'd earn enough to retire comfortably. We had no idea we were sitting on a gold mine. The patent sold for $30 million in 2010. $30 million. Alexander was 27 then, fresh out of graduate school with his marketing degree and full of aspirations about building his own career. Jonathan and I made a decision that day that would shape the next 13 years of our lives. We told Alexander we'd received a significant settlement, enough to be very comfortable, but nothing extravagant. He never questioned it, probably assumed it was several million at most. What Alexander didn't know was that 30 million was merely the beginning. Jonathan and I took that money and began investing systematically. Conservative blue-chip stocks initially, then growth companies as we learned the market, real estate in emerging areas, technology startups with solid fundamentals. Jonathan had an exceptional gift for spotting undervalued opportunities before the market recognized them. By the time he died 7 years ago in 2018, our portfolio was worth over $1 billion. $1 billion, the same amount I'd later use to acquire Whitmore Enterprises 2 years after Jonathan's death. The irony was exquisite. While Chelsea had been giving me concerned looks and asking if I needed help managing my finances as I aged, I'd been the anonymous investor who'd rescued her father's failing company, the same company he'd nearly destroyed through overexpansion and poor debt management, forcing him to accept a buyout from what he believed was a corporate investment firm. That investment firm was a shell company I controlled. I'd purchased Whitmore Enterprises not out of malice, but because it was fundamentally sound beneath Williams' mismanagement. The company had excellent bones, solid customer relationships, and talented employees. It simply needed proper financial oversight. Under new management, it was thriving. The man who'd just been labeled a burden had been living off my business decisions for the past 3 years. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, looking directly at William. "I think you have me confused with someone else." But we both knew he didn't. I could see the recognition in his eyes, the memory of that boardroom meeting where I'd sat quietly while my attorneys handled the negotiations. He'd barely acknowledged me then, assuming I was merely someone's wife along for the formalities. Now, as Chelsea stared at us both with growing alarm, I realized my carefully maintained discretion was about to become extraordinarily complicated. The following morning, I sat in my comfortable apartment sipping coffee from my favorite mug, watching Alexander pace across my living room like a caged tiger. He'd called at 6:30 a.m., demanding answers to questions I wasn't prepared to address. Sleep had been impossible after the reception, my mind replaying William Whitmore's recognition and the panic I'd seen flash across Chelsea's eyes. "Mother, you have to help me understand what happened last night," Alexander said, running his hands through his hair the same way he had as a frustrated child. "William Whitmore pulled me aside after you left and asked some very pointed questions about Father's patents and your investment activities. I'd slipped out quietly after William's revelation, claiming exhaustion. The truth was, I needed time to strategize. 14 years of carefully maintained privacy had cracked in a single moment, and I wasn't certain how to handle the exposure. Alexander had inherited his father's intensity, but channeled it differently. Where Jonathan had been methodical and strategic, Alexander was direct and emotional." "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I had a reasonable idea. He wanted to know about Father's technology patents, about whether you'd been involved in any major business transactions, about our family's actual financial situation. Alexander stopped pacing and fixed me with those serious brown eyes he'd inherited from Jonathan. "Mother, he seemed to think you were some kind of major investor. It was absurd." The coffee tasted bitter suddenly. This was the conversation I'd been both expecting and dreading for years. Alexander had built his career as a senior marketing director through genuine talent and determination. He'd earned his position at a respected firm, purchased his house through careful saving, and lived within his means because he believed those were the values Jonathan and I had taught him. How could I explain that while he'd been working 70-hour weeks to earn his promotions, I could have purchased his entire company without straining my budget? While he'd been saving diligently for his house down payment, I'd been managing a portfolio worth more than most small countries' GDP. "Alexander, sit down," I said gently. "We need to have a conversation." But before I could continue, my phone buzzed with a text message from Chelsea. "Catherine, I think we should have lunch today. There are some things Alexander and I would like to discuss with you. I showed Alexander the message, watching his expression shift from confusion to concern. What do you think she wants to discuss? I had a fairly good idea. Chelsea Whitmore wasn't the type to let mysteries remain unsolved, especially when they potentially involved substantial money. She'd probably spent the entire night questioning her father about his suspicions, and now she was prepared to investigate further. The question was, how much had William actually deduced from that brief boardroom encounter 3 years ago? I think, I said carefully, your wife is more perceptive than we've given her credit for. Alexander's phone rang, Chelsea's name appearing on the screen. He answered immediately, and I could hear her voice, even from across the room, bright and artificially cheerful. Alexander, darling, I was hoping we could all have lunch together today. There are some family matters I'd love to discuss with your mother now that we're officially relatives. When he hung up, Alexander looked at me with the same expression he'd worn as a teenager, when he suspected I knew more about his broken curfew than I was revealing. Mother, is there something you need to tell me about our family's finances? Outside my apartment window, I watched the familiar rhythm of morning commuters heading to work. People with straightforward concerns about deadlines and meetings and mortgage payments. I envied them their simplicity, their ordinary worries that seemed luxurious compared to my situation. Everything, I said finally. I need to tell you everything. Chelsea arrived at the restaurant 40 minutes early, already seated at a corner table when Alexander and I walked in. She'd chosen the most expensive establishment in town, I noticed, and had taken the seat that provided her with the optimal view of the entire room. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and she was wearing a designer suit I recognized from a recent fashion magazine. Catherine, Alexander, thank you so much for meeting me, she said, standing to embrace us both. Her smile was radiant, but I caught the calculating look in her green eyes as she assessed my simple black dress and modest jewelry. I ordered us a lovely bottle of wine to celebrate being family. The wine was a Bordeaux that cost more than most people spent on groceries in 6 weeks. Clearly, Chelsea was making a statement about her expectations for this conversation. This is lovely, dear, I said, settling into my chair, though perhaps a bit extravagant for a casual family lunch. Oh, I don't think anything about our family is casual anymore, she replied, her smile never faltering. I spent considerable time last night talking with Daddy about his business experiences, and he shared some fascinating stories about corporate acquisitions and anonymous investors. Alexander looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Chelsea, what does this have to do with lunch? She ignored him, focusing entirely on me. You know, Catherine, I majored in business at Harvard. I find corporate finance absolutely fascinating, especially complex investment structures and shell companies. Daddy mentioned that when Whitmore Enterprises was acquired, the buyer was remarkably discreet. I sipped my wine and waited. Let her make the first substantive move. The interesting thing about discreet investors, she continued, is that they often have excellent reasons for maintaining their privacy, usually involving substantial wealth that they prefer to keep out of public attention. That sounds reasonable, I said calmly. Chelsea leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a delicious secret. Daddy said the woman in the acquisition meeting was quiet, elegant, and seemed to defer to her attorneys, but he remembered thinking at the time that she had the bearing of someone accustomed to making significant decisions. Alexander was staring at me now, pieces beginning to fall into place in his mind. Mother. Before I could respond, Chelsea pulled out her phone and showed us a photograph. It was a news article from 3 years ago about the Whitmore Enterprises acquisition, including a small photo from the signing ceremony. There, partially obscured by lawyers and corporate executives, was a woman in a navy blue dress whose face was barely visible. The photo quality isn't excellent, Chelsea said conversationally, but the woman's posture, her height, even the way she holds her purse, It's remarkably similar to yours, Catherine. The silence stretched between us as Alexander studied the photo, recognition dawning in his expression. I had to admire Chelsea's thoroughness, even as I felt my carefully constructed privacy beginning to unravel. "That's quite a coincidence," I said finally. "Isn't it?" Chelsea's smile had a sharp edge now. Of course, coincidences happen all the time, like how my family's financial difficulties began right around the time someone paid $1 billion for Daddy's company, or how that same mysterious investor seemed to vanish completely after the acquisition, almost like they preferred to remain anonymous. Alexander set down his wine glass with trembling hands. "Mother, please tell me you're not who she thinks you are." I looked at my son, at the young man I'd raised to value honesty and integrity above all else, and realized that 14 years of well-intentioned deception had finally caught up with me. "Alexander, there are some things about your father's patents and our investments that I never explained to you." Chelsea's triumph was evident in every line of her perfectly composed face. But as I watched her savor what she clearly thought was her moment of victory, I found myself wondering if she had any idea what she'd just unleashed. 4 days later, I sat in my financial advisor's downtown office, watching Marcus Thompson review the documents I'd requested. The lunch with Alexander and Chelsea had ended with my son storming out after I'd confirmed his worst suspicions, and his new wife making veiled suggestions about family financial planning and shared responsibilities. Now, I needed to understand exactly what position I was in. "Catherine, I have to say, this is an unusual request," Marcus said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the Whitmore family financial profile spread across his mahogany desk. "Why the sudden interest in your daughter-in-law's family background?" I'd called Marcus the morning after our disastrous lunch, asking for a comprehensive analysis of the Whitmore family's current financial situation. What I'd learned was more complex than I'd expected, because I didn't realize when I bought Whitmore Enterprises that I was acquiring my future daughter-in-law's inheritance. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Your daughter-in-law? The one who just married Alexander?" When I nodded, he let out a low whistle. "That's extremely complicated. Tell me something I don't know." He pulled up several files on his computer, cross-referencing data I'd requested. "All right, let's walk through this chronologically. In 2019, Whitmore Enterprises was struggling with debt service on expansion loans they'd taken in 2017. William Whitmore had overextended the company, buying smaller competitors, and when the economy tightened, they couldn't service the debt load. I remembered that acquisition well. It had been one of my more strategic investments, buying a fundamentally sound company at a significant discount because of temporary financial stress. What was the family's expectation at that time? According to the financial records we've obtained, Chelsea Whitmore had been positioning herself as the eventual successor to her father. She'd worked there summers during college, completed her MBA with a focus on family business management, and had been telling people she'd be taking over the company after a transition period. The pieces were fitting together in an uncomfortable way. So, when I acquired the company and brought in professional management, I eliminated her expected career path. More than that, you eliminated what she saw as her birthright. Marcus pulled up another document. "Here's where it gets interesting. I've been monitoring some discreet inquiries about your investment activities. Someone has been asking questions about shell companies, acquisition structures, and anonymous investors." My stomach tightened. What kind of questions? Professional-level questions, not casual curiosity, but the kind of research that suggests someone with business training and possibly legal connections. He turned his monitor toward me. "Catherine, I think your daughter-in-law has hired a private investigator." The implications hit me immediately. 14 years of careful legal structures and deliberate discretion could be unraveled by someone with sufficient motivation and resources. How vulnerable are we? That depends on how deep they're willing to dig and what they plan to do with the information. Marcus's expression was serious. Your privacy protections are solid, but they're not impenetrable. A determined investigation with legal backing could eventually trace the ownership structures back to you. I thought about Chelsea's behavior at lunch, the way she'd presented her discoveries like a chess player revealing a winning strategy. What would you recommend? Honestly, get ahead of this. If she's building a case for some kind of financial claim or family obligation, it's better to control the narrative than to be exposed by it. He leaned back in his chair, considering. But Catherine, there's something else you need to think about. If this becomes public, it won't just affect you. Alexander's career could be impacted if it looks like his success was connected to family wealth he wasn't even aware of. I hadn't fully considered that angle. Alexander's reputation in the marketing world was built on merit. If it came out that his mother was a billionaire investor, people might question every promotion he'd earned, every client relationship he'd built. The irony was bitter. I'd hidden my wealth to protect him, and now that secret might damage everything he'd worked to achieve. There's one more thing, Marcus continued, pulling up a final document. The Whitmore family's current financial situation is more precarious than it appears. They've been maintaining their lifestyle through credit and loans, probably expecting William to find another business opportunity or for Chelsea to marry into substantial wealth. And now she thinks she has. Exactly. But Catherine, if they're planning some kind of approach for financial assistance or inclusion in your investments, you need to be prepared for what that might look like. This isn't going to be a simple family conversation anymore. As I left Marcus's office, I realized I was facing the same decision Jonathan and I had made 14 years ago, except now the stakes were much higher. This time, I wouldn't just be protecting my son's independence. I'd be fighting to prevent everything I'd built from being turned against my family. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened a bottle of the good wine Jonathan and I had been saving for special occasions, poured myself a generous glass, and spread 14 years of financial records across my dining table. If Chelsea wanted to play investigator, she was about to discover she'd chosen the wrong person to underestimate. The numbers told a story of patience and strategy that I'd almost forgotten. Jonathan and I hadn't just gotten lucky with his patent sale. We'd been methodical, researching every investment, diversifying carefully, and reinvesting profits into emerging opportunities. That initial $30 million had grown to $75 million by 2013, then to $300 million by 2016. By the time Jonathan died, we were worth over $1 billion, and I'd continued growing it steadily. More importantly, I'd been quietly building something larger than just wealth. I owned significant stakes in 16 different companies, held licensing agreements on 24 different technologies, and had investments in everything from renewable energy to biotechnology. I wasn't just wealthy. I was connected to innovation in ways that even Marcus didn't fully understand. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. Mother, Chelsea and I would like to come over tomorrow evening. She has some ideas about how our family should handle this new information. I almost laughed. Chelsea had ideas, did she? I could imagine what those ideas might include. Probably something involving trust funds and family meetings and a more collaborative approach to financial decision-making. What she didn't understand yet was that I'd been managing expectations and protecting my interests longer than she'd been working in business. I pulled up the legal documents Marcus had provided about the Whitmore family's finances. Their situation was more fragile than I'd initially realized. The family estate was mortgaged at 80% of its current value. Their investment accounts had been systematically depleted to maintain their lifestyle, and they had significant credit obligations tied to William's assumption that he'd eventually monetize his business relationships. William Whitmore thought he'd retired comfortably on the proceeds from selling his company. But the reality was more complex. Much of his retirement income came from consulting fees and board positions I'd arranged through Whitmore Enterprises' new management. His comfortable lifestyle was more dependent on my continued ownership than he realized, but that was just the surface. I opened my laptop and began researching the specifics of Chelsea's recent activities. If she'd hired a private investigator, there would be traces: financial records, communication patterns, changes in her daily routine that suggested she was building a case for something. What I found was fascinating and concerning. Chelsea had indeed hired a private investigation firm specializing in corporate asset tracing. She'd also been in contact with an attorney who specialized in family wealth disputes. Most telling, she'd opened several new credit accounts in the past month, probably financing her investigation with the expectation that it would pay off substantially. She hadn't married my son for love. She'd married him as an investment strategy. The wine was making me philosophical, or maybe just honest with myself for the first time in years. I'd spent 14 years being the discreet widow, content to let people assume I was living comfortably but modestly while I quietly built something substantial. But Chelsea's little performance at the wedding reception had changed something fundamental. I was tired of being underestimated. More than tired. I was done. Tomorrow, when Alexander brought his wife to discuss her ideas for our family's financial future, I was going to give them both an education in exactly who they'd decided to investigate. Because Catherine Wells, the careful investor, was about to become Catherine Wells, the strategic opponent, and I had 14 years of experience in winning games that other people didn't even know they were playing. Alexander arrived at my apartment the next evening with Chelsea, both carrying themselves like diplomats approaching a delicate negotiation. I'd prepared for their visit carefully, setting out a simple cheese and fruit plate and opening a moderately priced bottle of wine. Nothing that would suggest the resources I actually had available. "Mother, thank you for agreeing to sit down with us," Alexander began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone walking through a minefield. "I know the last few days have been complicated." Chelsea had dressed for the occasion in a conservative business suit, her MBA training evident in the portfolio she carried and the way she'd arranged herself in my chair. "Catherine, I want to start by saying that everything we discuss tonight stays within the family. We're all on the same side here." I almost smiled at her presumption. "Of course, dear. What did you want to discuss?" She opened her portfolio, revealing several documents she'd obviously prepared with care. "Well, I've been thinking about our conversation at lunch, and I realize we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. What I'd like to propose is a more collaborative approach to family financial planning." "Collaborative how?" I asked. Alexander shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly uncertain about the direction this was heading. "Chelsea has some ideas about how we might structure things to benefit everyone involved." "The thing is, Catherine," Chelsea continued, her voice taking on the confident tone of someone presenting a business proposal, family wealth works, best when it's managed strategically across generations. "Alexander and I have been discussing how we might create a structure that protects your privacy while providing more transparency for family planning." There it was, the real purpose of this meeting. I sipped my wine and waited for her to continue. "We were thinking about establishing a family foundation," she said, "something that would allow us to make charitable contributions while also providing some tax advantages and investment coordination." She pulled out what looked like a preliminary legal document. "I've had some initial conversations with an attorney who specializes in family wealth management." The audacity was breathtaking. She discovered I had money and immediately began planning how to access it, complete with legal consultation and formal proposals. "That sounds very thorough," I said. "The foundation would be controlled by a board of family trustees," she continued enthusiastically. "You, me, Alexander, eventually any children we might have. It would give us all input into major financial decisions while maintaining appropriate oversight." Alexander was staring at the documents she'd produced, looking overwhelmed. "Chelsea, maybe we should slow down here. This is a lot to process." "Actually, Alexander, I think your wife has put considerable thought into this proposal," I said calmly. Tell me, Chelsea, what kind of initial funding were you envisioning for this foundation? Her eyes lit up at what she interpreted as interest. Well, that would depend on the scope of the charitable activities we wanted to pursue. I was thinking maybe we'd start with something substantial enough to make a real impact. Perhaps 75 or 80 million to establish credibility in the philanthropic community. 75 or 80 million as a starting point from a woman who'd called me a burden less than a week ago. And the board structure you mentioned, I continued conversationally, how would voting rights be allocated? I think equal representation makes the most sense, she replied confidently. 3 trustees, 3 votes. Very democratic. I set down my wine glass and looked directly at her. Chelsea, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you love my son? The question clearly caught her off guard. She glanced at Alexander, then back at me. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Do you love Alexander for who he is, or do you love what you think being married to him might provide you? The silence in the room was electric. Alexander was looking between us with growing alarm, and Chelsea's composed facade was beginning to crack. I think that's an unfair characterization of our relationship, she said finally. Is it? I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, pulling out a folder I'd prepared, because I have some information that might help clarify things. I returned to my seat and opened the folder, revealing the investigation report Marcus had prepared on Chelsea's recent activities. Her face went pale as she recognized some of the documents. This is a record of your communications with Sterling Private Investigations over the past 2 weeks, I said calmly. Apparently, you hired them to research corporate ownership structures and trace anonymous investors. Quite expensive, from what I can see. Alexander stared at his wife with growing disbelief. Chelsea, you hired private investigators. It's not what it sounds like, she said quickly. I was just trying to understand our family's financial situation better. You were building a case, I corrected. These records show you also consulted with Morrison, Lee and Associates, a law firm specializing in family wealth disputes and trust challenges. I pulled out another document. This is interesting. You opened 3 new credit accounts in the past month, borrowing against your expected family financial improvements. That's quite an assumption to make. Chelsea was scrambling now, her careful composure completely gone. Catherine, you have to understand, I was just trying to protect our family's interests. If there are substantial assets involved, we need to plan appropriately. Whose interests exactly? I asked. Because according to this financial profile Marcus prepared, your family's situation is considerably more precarious than you've been letting on. I spread several more documents across the coffee table. Your parents' estate is mortgaged at nearly 80% of value. Their investment accounts have been depleted to maintain their lifestyle since your father lost Whitmore Enterprises. Most of their current income actually comes from consulting arrangements I've maintained through the company's new management. Alexander was reading over the documents, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like heartbreak. Mother, how do you know all this? Because, Alexander, when someone tries to investigate me, I investigate them back. And what I found is that your wife's family has been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for the past 3 years. Chelsea found her voice, but it was shaky now. That doesn't change the fact that we're family now, that we should be working together instead of against each other. You're absolutely right, I said, standing up and walking to my window. We should be working together. The question is, what kind of work did you have in mind? I turned back to face them both. Because here's what I think happened. You discovered that I have money and you immediately began planning how to access it, not how to contribute to it, not how to help manage it, but how to restructure it so you'd have control over spending decisions. That's not fair, Chelsea protested, isn't it? I pulled out one more document from my folder. This is a transcript of a phone conversation you had with your college roommate 3 weeks before you met Alexander. In it, you specifically mention that you're tired of dating men who can't provide financial security, and that you're looking for someone from a stable family with good long-term prospects. The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before, and Chelsea looked like she was calculating how quickly she could retreat from this conversation. "Alexander," I said gently, "I think you need to ask yourself whether the woman you married is the person you thought she was." But even as I said it, I realized that this confrontation was just the beginning. Chelsea Whitmore wasn't the type to give up easily, and I'd just shown her exactly how much was at stake. If she'd been strategic before, she was about to become dangerous. "What happens now?" Alexander asked quietly. I looked at my son, at the man I'd raised to value honesty and hard work, and made a decision that would change all our lives. Now we find out what everyone is really made of. The next 2 weeks passed in careful silence. Alexander moved back to his apartment temporarily, telling me he needed time to process everything and figure out what's real anymore. Chelsea had stormed out of my apartment that night, but not before making it clear that she considered our conversation a declaration of war. She proved to be more dangerous than I'd anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus Thompson called me on a Friday morning, his voice tight with concern. "Catherine, we have a significant problem. Someone has been making inquiries with the SEC about your investment structures. Professional inquiries suggesting they're building a case for some kind of regulatory violation." I felt my stomach drop. What kind of violations? Failure to properly disclose beneficial ownership in publicly traded companies, potential insider trading around some of your acquisitions, questions about whether your shell companies properly reported their activities. He paused. "Catherine, this isn't casual curiosity anymore. Someone is trying to build a legal case against you." I knew exactly who that someone was. "How serious is this?" "It depends on what they find and what they intend to do with it. Your structures are legal, but complex financial arrangements can sometimes look suspicious to regulators who don't understand the full context. If they file a formal complaint, you could be looking at months or years of investigation, even if you're ultimately cleared." The implications were staggering, not just the legal costs and time, but the publicity that would destroy the privacy I'd maintained for 14 years. What would you recommend? Honestly, end this before it escalates further. Whatever family dispute triggered this investigation needs to be resolved quickly, because regulatory scrutiny has a way of expanding beyond the original complaint. I hung up and sat in my apartment thinking through my options. Chelsea had escalated from private investigation to potential legal warfare, probably hoping to force me into a settlement rather than risk public exposure. It was actually a clever strategy, if morally questionable. My phone rang. Alexander's name appeared on the screen. "Mother, we need to talk. Something's happened." He arrived an hour later, looking haggard and older than his 35 years. "Chelsea's filed for separation," he said without preamble. "Her lawyer says she's concerned about potential financial liabilities from undisclosed family assets." I almost admired her thoroughness. By filing for separation, she was protecting herself legally while positioning for a potential divorce settlement. "I'm sorry, Alexander." "Are you?" He looked at me with eyes that held more pain than anger. "Because it feels like you orchestrated this whole thing, like you wanted my marriage to fall apart so you could prove some point about her motivations." The accusation hit harder than I'd expected. "Alexander, I never wanted your marriage to fail. I wanted you to understand who you'd married before it was too late to make an informed choice. By destroying her family's financial security, by investigating her like she was a criminal." He shook his head. "Mother, I don't even know who you are anymore." That hurt, but I pushed through it. "I'm the same person who raised you to value honesty and integrity. the same person who wanted you to succeed on your own merits rather than family money. And look how that turned out, he said bitterly. My wife is leaving me. Her family's financial situation is collapsing, and now I find out my mother is some kind of corporate mogul who's been lying to me for 14 years. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him the way I had when he was a child with a scraped knee or a broken toy, but the distance between us felt unbridgeable. Alexander, there's something else you need to know. Chelsea has filed complaints with federal regulators about my investment activities. She's trying to force me into a public legal battle. He stared at me. What does that mean? It means this isn't over. It's just beginning. And I need you to decide whether you're going to stand with me or let her destroy everything I've built to protect our family. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Alexander looked up at me with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What do you need me to do? The meeting took place in Marcus Thompson's conference room the following Monday. Present were myself, Alexander, Chelsea, her attorney David Pierce, and her parents William and Vivian Whitmore. The atmosphere was tense enough to cut with a knife. Let's be clear about why we're here, David Pierce began, adjusting his expensive suit as he spread documents across the mahogany table. My client has discovered that Mrs. Wells has been concealing substantial assets while allowing her son's wife's family to experience financial hardship. This suggests either a deliberate pattern of deception or potential financial impropriety that warrants investigation. Marcus Thompson, sitting beside me, responded calmly. Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Wells' financial activities are completely legal and properly reported. Your client's recent regulatory complaints appear to be motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. Chelsea leaned forward, her voice carefully controlled. This isn't about personal grievances. This is about family responsibility and transparency. Catherine has been manipulating people's lives while pretending to be something she's not. I finally spoke. Chelsea, I've never manipulated anyone. I invested in underperforming companies and improved them. I maintained my privacy because I preferred discretion to publicity. Neither of those things is illegal or immoral.